Today's show is sponsored by CloudZero. For software-driven companies focused on growing margins, CloudZero is the only cloud cost intelligence platform that puts engineering in control by connecting technical decisions to business results. By analyzing cloud services like AWS and Snowflake, CloudZero provides real-time cost insights that help you maximize margins. Engineering teams can answer critical questions like, who are my most expensive customers? How much does this specific feature cost our business? What's the cost impact of re-architecting this application? With cost anomaly alerts via Slack, product-specific data views, and granular engineering context that makes it easy to investigate any cost, CloudZero is your complete cloud cost intelligence platform, connecting the dots between high-level trends and individual line items. Join companies like Drift, Rapid7, and SeatGeek by visiting cloudzero.com/cloudcast to get started today. That's cloudzero.com/cloudcast.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. We start to move into the sort of middle third of July here in 2021, and temperatures starting to heat up. People are starting to go on some vacations, and that would give you a nice Sunday perspective show to think about some stuff over the weekend and as you start your week. Hope everybody, again, is doing well. You know, one of the questions that came up on the mailbag a couple of weeks ago was, you know, do we expect to see any big changes amongst the cloud providers, right? You know, as it is now, the pecking order is sort of Amazon, AWS, Microsoft with Azure, and then, you know, depending on who you talk to, either Google or Alibaba, typically Google sort of third and then Alibaba. You know, and as I was thinking about that, you know, it's always easy at any given time, especially as one company continues to do fairly well, to sort of say, yeah, you know, I expect things will just sort of stay the same, right? We'll see Amazon continue to do very well. We'll continue to see Microsoft do well. And I was thinking about it, you know, I started digging into the different companies just to sort of better understand not only their personality, their strategy, sort of the things that make them unique, but also when you talk about the three big cloud companies, you really kind of have to talk about their parent company as well, because, you know, they do so many other things that, you know, cloud is a part of it. And, you know, you sort of want to put it in the context of kind of what they do overall. And as I was digging into it, it really kind of dawned on me, as I was thinking about Microsoft in particular, the amount of change that's gone on at Microsoft since Satya Nadella took over as CEO in 2014. And as I started to really dig into it, I thought, you know, this would be kind of an interesting topic to dive into and really kind of look at the amount of change they had to go through, the choices they had to make, because there were some very, very significant choices. There was some very, very significant baggage left over from the previous leadership that had been there. And so I thought what we'd do in today's show is really kind of dive into how Microsoft, and in particular, you know, Azure, but kind of all of Microsoft has evolved, Azure obviously being a huge part of it, as we dig into that. And then we're going to dig into that right after the break.
Today's show is sponsored by Okta, the leading independent identity solution. Okta provides best-in-class authorization so your customers and workforce can safely access what they need most right when they need it from anywhere. Organizations around the world trust Okta's Identity Cloud to sign in, authorize, and manage users, whether it's employees, contractors, partners, or customers. And with Okta's developer tools, you'll never have to build authentication again. Our customizable code blocks are flexible and future-proof with easy-to-use APIs and SDKs, so you can do less coding and more shipping. Okta is dedicated to building the most reliable, neutral identity platform because it means protecting more than a login. Identity is protecting people, their ideas, their work, their brilliance. It's protecting your future with confidence. Learn more at okta.com. That's OKTA.com.
Today's show is brought to you by CBT Nuggets. You know how much we value ongoing education on the Cloudcast, and CBT Nuggets is exactly what Aaron and I wish we had when we were trying to get our certification early in our careers. CBT Nuggets is all about bringing a personalized touch to learning about cloud computing, virtualization, networking, DevOps, and much, much more. Whether it's their hands-on labs with personalized coaching or the online chat functions that come up with every instructor-led course, CBT Nuggets' team of experts is always there to help you get the most from your training and your path to certification. You can check it all out at cbtnuggets.com/cloudcast and sign up for a free trial. You get access to the full catalog of great training, including virtual labs, quizzes, and other premium features completely free for the first 7 days. That's cbtnuggets.com/cloudcast. And we're back. And, I think what we're going to do with this show, we've done a number of shows, sort of lesson learned from, some of the technologies or technology companies that, sort of took off and maybe went through some transitions. But I really kind of want to do sort of a lessons learned from, the sort of the tenure of Satya Nadella at Azure, because I think it's really interesting, especially not only how Microsoft's transformed since 2014 when he took over, but really kind of also put it in the context of any company who's going through some sort of transition, right? One of the big things that gets talked about all the time is that, from computing paradigm to computing paradigm, it's very unusual to see the leading company continue to be even, not just lead from transition to transition, but even be relevant from transition to transition. And we've seen this, from mainframe to microcomputers to desktops and PCs to the internet, now cloud. And then we're, kind of seeing how long cloud will sort of stretch itself out when it starts to, we start to talk about things like edge and IoT and other forms of computing and so forth. And if we put Microsoft in context, right, Microsoft has been, a really significant technology company since the 70s. And they've been through the PC era. They went through the cloud era and mobile and so forth. Didn't necessarily, start off great, and in some cases sort of failed. So I thought what I would do is sort of dive through that and really kind of look at it, because I think some of the changes they've made, the choices they've made, have been really interesting. And I not only want to look at them by themselves, but also look at them in the context of, what other companies may be thinking about and how they go through transitions. So let's start with some context. Prior to Satya Nadella, Microsoft had gone through some significant changes. Bill Gates, the original founder and CEO, had sort of stepped away from the business. Steve Ballmer had taken over as CEO. He had obviously a very large business that they had built, but he really went through some transitional phases. And, I think, if you think about where Microsoft was as of 2014 when Satya Nadella was named CEO, they had a very strong business, very large business, especially driven by, Windows, Microsoft Office, Windows Server. That was kind of the core of their business, if you will. But they had really kind of failed on a number of really significant things. And so if I think about that, essentially they failed at social networking. They, weren't able to create their own social network. They failed in an attempt to acquire like Facebook. So sort of failed there. They had failed in search. Bing had never really taken off. They essentially were, at some point, began to sort of outsource that to Google. They really had failed at mobile. Windows Mobile never really took off. They tried to basically make Windows Mobile a desktop, sort of a small form factor of a desktop. They lost very badly to both Apple and Android. Tried to sort of make it up by buying Nokia. It was like a $10 billion acquisition that Steve Ballmer did. That failed. They never really made it in streaming. You think about all the streaming services, right? They had a big early footprint in media with things like MSNBC and the Microsoft MSN network and so forth. But, things like Netflix and Hulu and plenty of other streaming things sort of, were in their place. And then, at the time, Windows was really looked at, especially, 2012, 2013, was really looked at as kind of a laggard. Mac was, there was the famous Mac versus Windows commercials and, constantly making Windows look like this just old-timey thing that your dad ran. And it was, wasn't slick, didn't have any pizzazz. So, Microsoft was in not the best place in the world. Now, granted, they had a very large revenue footprint. I think they were doing about $85 billion at the time. So Satya Nadella comes along, and as I think about the challenges that he sort of had, and you think about where they are today, there are a number of areas that he really, really changed. He got them into, and the reason I think this is interesting is because, in the past, or with a lot of companies, they would have said, well, who are we competing against? We're competing against Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, lots of the big players because of their size. And they might have said, well, we need to double down on some things. Maybe we failed before, we got to double down and try some things. And Nadella really kind of moved them, they sort of skipped certain stages. They really didn't necessarily double down on some things. And, if you think about where they are today, they got into gaming. They made a big acquisition that eventually got them Minecraft and started Xbox Studios and so forth. So they got into gaming. They saw that early on, and they've done very, very well with Xbox. I think one of the biggest things is they were a Windows company, right? They were very, very Windows centric. And I think probably one of the things that probably opened their eyes at the time was, realizing that, when mobile came along and it wasn't Windows centric, that there was going to be an entire ecosystem of things that weren't going to run Windows, right? They're going to run Android, they're going to run iOS and so forth. And what was really interesting, I think, is as they evolved the Azure cloud, it started supporting Linux. And that was a big deal at the time. I think people look at it now and they go, oh yeah, well, every cloud has Linux. But it was a big deal for Microsoft to support Linux. I want to say the numbers I've heard is about half or so of the workloads that run on the Azure cloud are now Linux. Maybe it's more than that at this point. But, they had to disavow themselves from Windows being the core of their business, right? You think about it, they missed mobile. The cloud wasn't going to necessarily be Windows. You had all these people running these slick laptops that weren't going to be running Windows. Windows is obviously still now a thing, and Windows 11 is out and so forth. But I think they probably had to have sort of a as they say, come to Jesus moment around, is the operating system the center of our future, or does it need to be much more than that? Does it need to be above that? Right? And I think they proved that to a certain extent as Microsoft Office could begin to run not only on other operating systems like Mac, but they were able to transition from being a very software-centric business, a download business, software in a box business, to the cloud. And that's another, so not only did they move out of being Windows-centric, so they had to change their identity upon the operating system. They had to change their identity from being a software company to being a cloud company. And they went through some fits and starts. They've made huge investments, obviously, in their data centers and their cloud expertise and so forth. They've gone through some fits and starts. They had some outages, but they learned from Bing. They learned from the good and the bad of Bing. They learned from gaming. They learned from some of the early things that went on in Azure, and they continue to learn there. And I think they've also continued to acquire assets that are helping them learn and grow. So you look at things like GitHub, and you look at things like LinkedIn. Organizations that run large cloud-based environments and so forth. So they went through these big changes, right? They had to change the way that they interact with developers, right? Developers, they have a very strong relationship with Microsoft. They had to change the way that they delivered software. They went from a software company to a cloud company. They had to move from Windows-centric, everything Windows-centric, to being Windows agnostic, OS agnostic, supporting Linux, supporting other types of technologies, other databases. It wasn't just SQL and so forth. And so, they had to go through those pretty huge changes. And if you think about your company, whether you work for a technology company or you work for somebody else, to sort of have the intestinal fortitude and to have the ability to change the core DNA of your company, and be able to move away from a technology that was making you billions and billions of dollars and was at the core of what you were doing, but to realize that the industry had moved from that is a huge, huge thing. And if we think about kind of where Microsoft is today, they're a company, like we said, that not Windows centric. Windows is still a part of what they do, but it's part of what they do. They are no longer software centric. They're a cloud company, and they went through a lot of fits and starts as far as how do we help customers migrate to the cloud? How do we create a like for like experience where it makes sense? How do we incentivize the people who had previously sold or supported software to now be part of the cloud? They made some acquisitions that were really, really developer focused, right? We've seen not only things like GitHub, which, has obviously been in the news, but, is a tremendous asset in terms of being part of every developer's everyday experience. We've seen them make evolutions of VSCode. We've seen them embrace open source. I can't believe I got this far into the podcast and had sort of forgotten about open source, but, 2014, open source wasn't part of the Microsoft DNA. And now you look at, open source communities, and Microsoft is one of the largest contributors. Not only are they contributing code, they're contributing to docs, they're acquiring companies that are, heavily into open source. So they've gotten away from that Balmer mentality of open source is cancer to open source is something that people want. And then they also, have started to leapfrog in places. You would have thought, well, they missed mobile. Maybe they're going to come back and try and do mobile again. They had bought Nokia. Steve Ballmer tried to get them into that. They sort of learned that lesson. They moved past it. But now they are back in hardware, right? They're in hardware with Xbox, but they're also in hardware with Surface, right? They felt like they got away from, purely OEMing Windows to third-party laptop providers, and now they have their own, right? And they've realized, that you've got to be able to transition from, only a certain channel to market, route to market, certain way of interacting with your ecosystem to, there's an opportunity for the customers that want a very specific hardware and software combined experience. And so that's another area that's been really, really interesting to watch them transition to. So, you think about all the things that Microsoft has had to go through, that Satya Nadella has helped them transition through, proprietary to open source, software to cloud, Windows to OS agnostic, the willingness to, work with different technology partners, than they had worked in before, getting into new areas that weren't a big when they first got started, like gaming and some other things. And I think another thing that they've done really, really well, and this is maybe something that differentiates them from some of the other cloud providers, and we'll see how much of a role this really plays in how customers decide to buy in the cloud. I know it has some influence in certain industries, is they really haven't tried to get into the industries that a lot of their customers are in. Yes, they're in gaming, and yes, they're in devices and certain things. So there's some overlap with how they deal with their ecosystem, but you don't see them getting into banking. You don't see them getting into, trying to replace the, things in healthcare. They sort of partner with healthcare, right? They're not doing some of the things that some of the other cloud providers do that sometimes give some customers some pause. Now, does that totally affect whether they buy or not? It depends on the industry, right? We see some industries where it's more prevalent. Maybe it's retail and some others. But they are still sort of the, agnostic cloud, if you will. If you talk to buyers, you talk to companies and so forth, they still, they've got a very deep relationship with Microsoft. And so as I think about, not only where they are today, they're, depending on how you account for Azure, we've talked about this a million times in the show. Are their numbers the same as Azure or in the ballpark? That's a little hard to tell. Some people will say, no, they're only half the size of AWS. Others will say, no, they're relatively close. They're in the ballpark. Again, it has to do with how they do accounting. They account for more than just what's in Azure. They call it intelligent cloud, so it involves some on-premise software as well. But we've really seen them go through transitions, and really hard transitions, right? Like they really aren't tied to too many things that were there, even 5, 6 years, 7 years ago. And, for those of you that are sort of new to the space and never knew Microsoft to be doing those things, they were pretty adamant. They were pretty adamant about, owning, certain ways, being very opinionated about certain ways. And so I think, as I get back to the original sort of question at the top of the show is, will we see, any cloud sort of take off? Will we see any dynamics sort of change? I think the mindset, the DNA that Satya Nadella has been able to infuse into Microsoft, the ability to, work through how do we transition from, one core technology, core philosophy, core DNA to something really different has been very interesting, And I looked back and I looked at the different stock prices of a bunch of companies around that same time in 2014. And while Amazon is up about 10x in terms of stock price, Microsoft is up 7x, 7.5x. Apple is also up about 7x, and Google's only up about 4 to 5x in that same time frame. So, they've been very, very competitive. Why they're not necessarily mentioned with the FANG companies, I don't totally know. Maybe it just doesn't make sense for the acronym. But we've said this over and over again. If I'm looking at the one cloud company that I feel like is doing things really different and both meeting their customer needs, but also having made really interesting investments, and interesting in the sense of, again, able to break the mold, able to transition. They're a very large company, but able to really listen to the market, kind of put their pride down sometimes. I think Microsoft's been really interesting. And I think as we look at the list of things that, they've been able to transition just, in a short period of time, 6-7 years. And I didn't even mention like collaboration. Teams is doing very, very well. We saw them do very, very well in the pandemic and so forth. So they've sort of learned, how to be, a company that can work both with large enterprises, but remote companies and so forth. So, I think as we dig into it, Amazon's always very interesting, lots of innovation and so forth. The other thing I thought was really interesting, and I'll leave with sort of this one sort of note that I found as I was digging into it. Microsoft has done 85 acquisitions since Satya Nadella joined in 2014. 85 acquisitions, 85 acquisitions over 7 years. What does that work out to be? About 14, 15, something in that range, 13 to 15 a year. That's a lot. And that means that your company has embraced not only internal innovation, but also willingness to go off, find new technologies, things to bolster what you're doing. And I think, you got to have a balance of those two things. The companies that are really successful over time both can balance what you build internally, but also have an engine for being able to acquire, leverage the assets that you have. So I think it's been really interesting to watch Microsoft. I think I think about that question that was asked of, do we expect to see any really big changes? I think Microsoft's one to keep an eye on, just in terms of, they've shown that they can really, really transition from, a big stable base, which is hard because people worry about, will the stock price go down? Will we lose customers? To a much, much bigger stable base and a much, much bigger growing base. So with that, I'm going to kind of wrap it up. I kind of call this show, the transformation of Microsoft. I think it's really been the leadership of Satya Nadella and obviously his team around that. But it's going to be an interesting thing to watch. I think, as we get into the next 5 years, decade of computing and cloud computing and edge computing. I think it's really interesting to not only watch where innovation happens, but also how companies that have established places transition. Because as we mentioned at the top, it's really, really hard to transition as new paradigms happen. And there's only a few companies that ever really make it through that. Microsoft is showing that they plan to be one of those companies. So with that, I'm going to kind of wrap it up. Hope you've enjoyed this Sunday Perspective show. It was fun to sort of dig into some of the numbers behind how Microsoft's been evolving and really kind of looking at their strategy, looking at how they've evolved. So hope you've enjoyed the show. Hope you enjoy the shows each week, both Sundays and Wednesdays. Thanks again for telling a friend. Thanks for helping us grow the community. We're always amazed at not only how the community grows, but where it is and where it reaches, and 100 plus countries, which just blows our mind. So thank you as always for that. Thank you for everybody who gives us feedback on the show. Give us a rating on Apple Podcast or Spotify or anywhere else that you get your podcasts. And so with that, we're going to wrap up, and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.